So in the past couple months, I have played through the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy for the first time, so I just wanted to make a short little video of how I would rank all 3 games from the worst to the best. Real quick before we get started, keep in mind that this is just my list. It's completely subjective, so if your ranking is different from mine, feel free to share in the comments down below. I'd love to see it. Also, I have made videos covering each of these games individually, so if you're interested in checking them out after this video, links are in the description below, and let's get started. Coming in at third and last place is Final Fantasy 13-2. Now, I've seen a lot of people online say that they really enjoy this game. They weren't too crazy about the original 13, but thought this one was a substantial improvement. Best in the trilogy. I'm obviously not in that camp. To follow up on a game that wrapped up quite nicely at the end, 13-2 retcons that ending to kickstart a story that centers around time travel, which is so off the rails from the plot of the first game, and that would have been completely fine if it was somehow a gripping story, but it's more nonsensical than anything else. There were too many times in this game where I had to stop and try to make sense of things, and when I did, it still didn't entirely make sense. Going into this game, I was also very skeptical of having new lead characters when there was already a well-established cast, and they didn't change my mind at all. Sarah and Noel are noble but flat characters. They never really get more complex than 2 heroes going on an adventure together to save the world. To me, that's not very interesting. I will say though that this game does have the most compelling villain out of the 3 games. The main antagonist is someone who's motivated by his love for someone instead of simply being pure evil. One that also has a personal connection with one of our main protagonists, adding depth to the conflict, but it's just overshadowed by the absolute mess of a story that's in this game. As for the gameplay, 13-2 actually listened to a lot of the common complaints with the first 13, such as the linearity and the lack of substance, by having a more open-ended structure and quality of life improvements. Like, you have split paths for more exploration and puzzles to solve, but these changes kinda boggle the game down because they feel more like chores. They're fluff. I'd rather just go from point A to point B, constantly battling enemies like in the first game, but the combat actually regresses from the first game. It brings back the paradigm system with a few new features added, but I was rarely incentivized to utilize the system to its full extent because the enemies didn't require much strategy to defeat. With the exception of boss battles, I was really just spamming the same few buttons in all my fights. Overall, 13-2 only improves on aspects from the first game that I actually didn't mind while creating new issues, making it quite a mediocre game for me. Taking the number 2 spot is the original Final Fantasy 13. With the hardest job of establishing a world and characters from the ground up, it's very clear that the most effort put into telling a compelling narrative was with this game. It does have a unique and interesting concept, although the execution certainly needs work. The characters are the most dynamic in this game out of the whole trilogy. They start off as a group who are mostly strangers thrown into this dreadful situation together, and they get off on the wrong foot, going as far as almost killing each other. But throughout the course of the story, we see them gradually grow into this one big family, taking on the bigger conflicts surrounding the plot. That is absolutely beautiful. I was genuinely moved by the progression that these characters experience with each other. The original 13 also feels the most cinematic out of the 3 games, having these gorgeous CGI cutscenes that frequently appear throughout the game, which isn't the case in the sequels. Now, even though there's not nearly as much variety in the gameplay as the sequels, to me it's still superior than 13-2's because it at least does well with the little things it offers. Quality over quantity, you know? Quality kind of being a pretentious word because all you really do in this game is run forward and fight enemies until you reach the end, but the combat's rather enjoyable. The game's designed to be very restrictive on players, such as capping them at a certain level until they reach a certain part in the story and assigning parties for them for the first 20 hours or so. But these limitations force players to actually strategize in battle instead of just letting them grind until they're strong enough to demolish enemies, which is something I think 13-2 suffers from. Also, this game being called a hallway simulator, kind of an exaggeration. It's no doubt super linear, but the locations are designed well enough for me to not feel like I'm just running down a straight line, so it didn't really bother me. And regardless of how anyone perceives this game, it's one that only gets better as you progress. Players do eventually get to assign their own party, having more flexibility in creating a paradigm deck, and the game does open up for them to free roam. It's not a game that's very easy to revisit because it does take several hours to get to these points, not to mention just the pure repetitive nature of it, but I think it's a totally fine game to experience once. If I'm feeling a game that's more character driven and provides a cinematic experience, the original Final Fantasy 13 would be the game I turn to. But in first place is Lightning Returns Final Fantasy 13. This game has a much simpler story compared to its predecessors, which for me was much welcomed after the time travel shenanigans in 13-2. The plot is not innovative in the slightest, but it's one that makes enough sense from where 13.2 left off, and is easy to follow from start to finish. As a Lightning fan, it was also really nice having her back in the front and center. Where this game's strength really lie though is in the gameplay. It totally abandons the formula of the first two games by almost immediately throwing players into an open world with a time mechanic where they can accomplish and discover as little or as much as they like. It presents a brand new battle system that's more action oriented, and these changes really worked for me. I love the combat. It's not only unique but more engaging than the combat from the first two games. The time limit may be intimidating, but there's plenty of margin of error time to play the game without feeling rushed. It's also more of an asset rather than a restraint because the game does heavily incorporate this mechanic into the quest, adding layers to the gameplay. And when I was playing this game for the first time, there were moments where I was like, whoa, this game's actually really cool. Like, you get to customize Lightning's outfit however you want, which plays a substantial role in combat. The world has schedules that you need to work around corresponding with the time mechanic. You can commit monster genocide if you want to. And because the game lets players off the leash very early on into this well-designed open world, there's not really any pacing issues. The objectives can be done in any order, giving players that sense of freedom and control in their playthrough. There's no 20-hour tutorial, making it much easier to just hop into and play. So even though the story and character work aren't really strong in Lightning Returns, it's still the game that I had the most fun playing out of this trilogy. It's the one that I definitely replay the most times, and for that reason, it comes in at number 1. Remember, if you want my more in-depth take on each of these games, I've put links to those videos in the description. Let me know how you rank this trilogy. I'm sure my list is a bit controversial with 13.2 at the bottom. With that said, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.